Last week, I presented you with the first part of our examination of Joseph Smith Jr. and what Dr. Moraine, author of The Sword of Laban, called the dissociative mind. I would strongly recommend reviewing part one in order to comprehend tonight's program in its greatest light. Dr. William Moraine strongly suggests in his book that several horrific experiences in Joseph Smith's young life caused him to open up a secret part in his brain that even he is not aware of, and to dissociate it completely from his conscious thinking in order to deal with the traumatic event. Last week we discussed in detail the first major experience that could have caused this split, which were several brutal operations that were performed on Joseph Smith when he was a 6-year-old boy. Dr. Moraine suggests that following this operation, much of Joseph Smith's permanent personality structure evolved in the aftermath of these operations as Joseph adjusted to being the family's crippled child. It is of note that Joseph was severely hobbled for at least 3 years of his life thereafter and always walked with a limp. But what also contributed to his psychological makeup was the fact that the minute Joseph was well enough to travel, his parents sent the 6-year-old away, alone with his Uncle Jesse, to Salem, Massachusetts. In all probability, the boy never had been apart from his parents before, and now, at a moment critical for their acceptance and care and attention, he was sent away to Salem in hopes that the sea breezes would be of service to him. Dr. Moraine suggests that this exile added a whole new dimension to Joseph's dissociated mind, stating, quote, "The absence of the familiarity and affection of his family was to be one more crushing blow that his mortally wounded psyche would have to endure. Surely a very different boy returned from Salem." It was probably while at the seashore that Joseph's fantasies began, quote, "projecting from within an unspeakable horror he could not fully recall," says Dr. Moraine. It is not an accident that Joseph's epic literary adventures begin with disenchanted people leaving a place of safety and traveling to seashores. Like writer Stephen King, it's possible that here Joseph began to fantasize in grandiose proportions while unknowingly pulling from the trauma of his dissociated mind. Writes Dr. Moran, quote, "As we will see, these included fantasies of war, fantasies of people in chaos who escape to the seashore, fantasies of magic swords that dismember heads and arms." If you're familiar with the Book of Mormon, you're going to recognize many of these themes. Fantasies of sons overthrowing fathers, princes killing kings, righteous killing unrighteous. The author continued, fantasies of towers, trees, serpents, flaming swords, pillars, cigar-shaped boats, sickles, and stiff-necked people. Fantasies of evil men brought to humiliation by young heroes, of good fathers and evil fathers, of faithful women and whores, of good white people and evil black people, of good white people becoming evil black people, of being bound with cords, of blood on garments, of destroying angels with drawn swords. These fantasies would flood out his unconscious in hundreds of repetitive dreams and nightmares, in daydreams and random sequences, in play, in speech, and in silence. They took over the inner life of Joseph Smith Jr. as an automatic pilot takes over an aircraft. In this state, Dr. Moraine concludes, he limped into his future. Because of his experience with traumatized children who have dissociated their specific trauma to the recesses of their minds, Dr. Moraine claims that there are some commonalities these folks share. One is that they have come to believe that they have some sort of connection to God or to the unseen world, sort of like a gift of clairvoyance or even a prophetic gift. This might be the result of their tapping back into this strange imagery locked in their dissociated parts of their brain and mistaking it for heavenly inspiration. Usually this tapping back into the secret part of their mind would often be accompanied by trance-like states. Psychiatrist John Nehemiah describes these states in his book, Dissociative Disorder in Comprehensive Textbook of Psychiatry, saying, quote, "These persons are out of contact with their environment, and their eyes are often seen staring into space. It can be determined that their behavior represents the external manifestations of an inner hallucinatory re-experience of re-experiencing of the traumatic event, end quote. Psychologist Lenore Turr separately notes that people in the dissociate state exhibit, quote, loss of color and later have glassy-eyed stares. All of these observations, which come from non-religious professionals, support historic LDS descriptions of Joseph Smith Jr. when he went into his religious trances. Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, who was one of Joseph Smith's polygamous wives later on, describes Joseph Smith during his moments in this way, quote, at once his countenance changed, and he stood mute. There was a searchlight within him over every part of his body. I never saw anything like it on earth. He got so white that anyone who saw him would have thought he was transparent, end quote. Researcher Dan Vogel cites a description from LDS archives from the journal of one E. Stevenson that states, quote, his countenance seemed to me to assume a heavenly whiteness, and his voice was so piercing and forcible for my part, it impressed me so that it became indelibly imprinted upon my mind. Remember, too, that early in his life as a treasure seeker, and even as a translator of the Book of Mormon, Joseph, who was convicted by a court of law as a glass looker, would stare long and hard into a hat until he entered a state where images and ideas rolled forth from somewhere in his head, and his countenance contained an otherworldly appearance, including glassy stares and translucent skin. From his experience, Dr. Moraine suggests that Joseph most likely filled any leisurely moment of his life with reconstructed visualizations of the stored traumatic event, suggesting that he, like others with dissociated minds, would certainly draw other people into their orbit. He reminds us that Joseph's own mother reported that when Joseph was a young teenager, he would, quote, regale his family with vivid stories of imaginary characters for hours. Joseph Smith's own mother wrote in her biography, quote, during our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of traveling, the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. This he would do with much ease, seemingly as if he had spent his whole life with them. Parenthetically, Dr. Moraine adds in the book, not his whole life, Lucy, just from the age of 7. These stories, as we have mentioned before on the show, were all told by Joseph Smith before the golden plates were ever received or one page of the Book of Mormon had ever been written. Dr. Moraine notes, however, that even though the hidden traumatic memory propelled Joseph's mind and creativity, the themes and characters would often be represented in very narrow terms. And these never really changed, these terms, over the course of his life. They just morphed into different expressions. This is why the Book of Mormon characters are so wooden when you read the book, so black and white. And the thematic structure is so mundane and repetitive and wordy. For an excellent analysis of the prose that Joseph Smith used when writing the Book of Mormon as compared with the prose that the real prophets used when compiling the Bible, get M.T. Lamb's The Golden Bible, which you can purchase from utlm.org. It's an excellent book from a guy who knew the word back in the 1800s and pointed out all these significant things that makes the Book of Mormon just almost laughable. That's M.T. Lamb's The Golden Bible. It is fitting and typical, however, that many people with dissociated minds often express their trauma through literature. Psychologist Shengold writes that, quote, artistically, creativity involves a change from passive suffering of childhood traumatic experience to active manipulation and recreation of those experiences. Expert Elizabeth Waite said, human beings do not merely suffer or inflict suffering. They interpret suffering, invent myths to explain it, and prescribe rituals to control it. It is through literature that we find evidence of Joseph reliving over and over again the trauma locked into his dissociated mind. And it is because this trauma is locked away in a place that he doesn't even know where it's at and its contents that makes it so powerful and constantly reoccurring in their lives. Next week, I'm going to sort of delineate these themes and show you how throughout Joseph's life, he revisited them over and over and over again, both in his writings, in his revelations, and even in the temple ceremonies, which people still today undergo and embrace. I think it's important to detail a very significant event that occurred in Joseph Smith's adult life and served to sort of permanently put his dissociated mind into hyperdrive. It's an event that took all those things and painful experiences from his past, and when it occurred, he relived those experiences, and then he went full force into the maniacal Joseph Smith, which included the many wives he took on, and I believe that this experience threw him into him starting to get more and more wives at an accelerated pace. When we get back, we'll talk about it. And we're back. It's suggested that because of Joseph's age-appropriate Oedipal thoughts toward his mother, which we talked about last week, and the subsequent punishment he perceived that he received for having those thoughts at the hands of 12 doctors who kind of mutilated his leg, he would forever link his sexuality with danger. Like all dissociate issues, this condition would appear and reappear endlessly in his subconscious, and as that happens, it says the dissociative mind constantly tries to relive that experience in order to solve it. But they can't solve it because they don't even know what they're dealing with and trying to solve, because the original issue was kept hidden from them in the first place. You got all that? Well, Joseph was amazingly subjected to an exact reenactment of what caused his childhood dissociation in the first place, and I would suggest that this event literally sent him spiraling out of psychological control. In 1832, Joseph and Emma were living near Kirtland, Ohio with the Johnson family. They had recently adopted a set of twins, and Joseph was caring for one of them who had the measles when a drunken mob broke in with the intent to tar, feather, and castrate the Mormon prophet. Now, LDS leaders never speak the truth regarding this incident, and they rewrite history and paint Joseph as this innocent man who had done nothing but tried to serve God, and they took him, these drunken mob, and they tried to tar and feather him. They never mentioned castration, and they just wanted to tar and feather him and be mean to him and beat him up. But that isn't what happened. What they don't tell you is Eli Johnson, the older brother of Miranda, 16-year-old Miranda Johnson, in the home that Joseph was actually living in, was incensed at Joseph's intimacies with his sister. And the plans to castrate was in direct retaliation for his misuse of the object to be removed. Dr. Moraine suggests that Eli Johnson and the mob were very clear on the occasion as to why they were doing what they were doing, as revenge usually has a very clear verbal expressions. Where a witness claimed that there were 40 or 50 men present, it is very interesting that in Joseph's own account, he states that there was about a dozen. The same number that were there when they operated on his leg. In fact, there's a famous painting, a mural here in Salt Lake City that depicts this event, and it only shows 12 men and is honest to Joseph Smith's description of how many were there. These men took Joseph out of the house and forcibly held him down. In the struggle, one of the men, William Wast, who was regarded as the strongest man on the Western Reserve and who had boasted that he himself could take Joseph out of the Johnson house himself, was flattened by a single kick he received from Joseph as the mob tried to restrain him. While LDS storytellers today boastfully herald this kick as evidence of the power within their founding prophet, Dr. Moraine suggests otherwise, saying that, quote, "The strength displayed on this occasion must not be regarded as Joseph's customary power, but rather as resulting from the severest kind of adrenaline rush. William Waste and his companions," Moraine continues, "found themselves facing a thrice traumatized 7-year-old fending off a fourth assault on his manhood. Joseph was taken as he screamed mercy, which implies guilt, and stretched out on a large board and was stripped of his clothing. He was there subjected to brutal treatment, including tar and feathering. But these mistreatments were nothing compared to what waited for him next. A Dr. Dennison was convinced to join the mob and to bring his surgical instruments with him along so they could castrate Joseph for his dalliances with Miranda Johnson, who, by the way, later became one of Joseph Smith's plural wives too. Dr. Moraine suggests that upon seeing Dr. Dennison approach him with his surgical instruments in hand must have been the single most terrifying moment in Joseph Smith's adult life. Unfortunately, Fortunately or unfortunately, Dr. Dennison was unable to proceed personally and withdrew from the act. What is revealing in Joseph's own description, as revealed through a friend, is how he responded to this whole situation. Joseph's spirit, quote, says, seemed to leave his body, and during this period of insensitivity, he consciously stood over his own body, feeling no pain, and seeing and hearing all that transpired. Dr. Moraine adds, this statement is textbook description of the dissociated mind. The almost exact reenactment of this stressful childhood stimulus served to seal the abnormal mind function in Joseph Smith's head, while at the same time igniting a relentless need for him to constantly relive the twisted connection he established years earlier between eroticism and the threat of violence. In other words, it was this very stressful reenactment that threw Joseph into an escalating obsession with obtaining more and more secret wives, eroticism, under the constant threat of discovery, violence. I believe I now at least partially understand why Joseph did what he did and risked what he risked. Before we go to the phones, really quickly, I just want to read off to you quickly this compulsion of Joseph Smith's that grew from this time forward. Fanny Alger, 16 years old, Lucinda Harris, Louisa Beeman, Zena Jacobs, Percinda Buell, Agnes Coolbrith, Sylvia Lyon, Mary Leitner, Patty Sessions, Miranda Johnson, that girl, Elizabeth Davis, Sarah Kingsley, Delcina Johnson, Eliza R. Snow, Sarah Ann Whitney, who was only 17, Martha McBride, Ruth Voss Sayers, Flora Ann Woodworth, who was 16, Elizabeth Dow Partridge, who was 19, Eliza Marie Partridge, Elmira Johnson, Lucy Walker, who was 17, Sarah Lawrence and Maria Lawrence, who were both 17, Helen Mar Kimball, who was 14 years old when he took her as a wife, Hannah Els, 29, Elvira Holmes, Rhoda Richards, Desmodina Fulmer, Olive Frost, Melissa Lott, who was 19, Nancy Winchester, who was 14, and ending with Fanny Young. All this from the prophet that they praise.